I just mentioned Hitler in the editorial. What's with Tucker Carlson embracing a revisionist historian? Does anybody remember the guy's name? I read this story today. Tucker Carlson. He does like to push the envelope, doesn't he? He had on a guy who introduced something like one of the most important historians of today. Yeah. I'd never heard of the guy.
He's not a real historian.
He's not a real... Well, he believes Winston Churchill was the bad guy and Hitler was the good guy. I
the real villain.
I love people who think revisionism is just the way to get attention. Like whatever you say, I can undo it.
In this video, the air crackles with tension as Bill Maher and his guest confront one of the most contentious trends in modern America: the rewriting of history itself. The conversation veers into unsettling territory as they examine a curious and disquieting trend, revisionist history gaining traction on the right, with voices like Tucker Carlson challenging long-held truths about figures such as Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. What began as ideological skepticism now threatens to unravel a shared understanding of history itself, exposing a crack in the bedrock of American ideals. As Bill and his guests delve into Carlson's controversial broadcasts, they peel back the layers of a strange convergence, a world where parts of the right question America's past nobility, echoing criticisms often associated with the far left. Together, they unravel a disturbing phenomenon where America's foundational myths, once untouchable, become battlegrounds for influence. Here lies the crux of their debate. Has the political spectrum bent so far that the extreme edges now meet, leaving America at odds not just with itself but with its very own history? Let's watch the video.
Stop it. Stop it.
But this is the.
You think Hitler was the bad guy?
Yeah, intriguing concept. Look, this is the kind of, this is junk history that's getting peddled, and you know there are people who gravitate to this, but he elevates it, and I think that's
a business model for him. You know, it's his business model. He's a
grifter.
He's Tucker Carlson. Yeah, he's a grifter. He's a charlatan. You know, he's a useful idiot for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
You saw him sit across from him, and supposedly he's knowledgeable about history, but he bought into that whole. I call it like. Did you ever see the show Drunk History? You know,
I loved it.
Isn't that great?
Show.
Yeah. But it's like he bought into Putin's drunk history. You know.
Right. Okay.
And this guy, he seems to think like Churchill was in power in Britain all in the run up to the war, and he was pushing all the buttons, and he was making Hitler invade. You know, England went to him as a war leader because the war had started already because of Hitler. And I actually disagree with you. I think Tucker's sincere in this stuff, and I think it goes to a deep disaffection that parts of the right have, unfortunately, with America at its foundations. They've come to believe the country is fundamentally corrupt. So every piece of received wisdom, and I think some narratives are wrong and should be pushed back against, but every piece of received wisdom, including that I was going to say H.R. McMaster, but that Winston Churchill was one of the greatest figures in Western history, has to be questioned.
Which he was, but
Churchill? Was not one of the great?
Oh, of course he was. They're questioning.
But this is this weird, like, when did sort of hating America become hip on the far right? This is this mirror image sort of like feedback loop between the far right and the far left that's absolutely crazy, that people are totally...
They all meet. I mean,
As you can see in the clip above, Carlson's reassessment of Churchill, describing him not as a heroic wartime leader but as a potential villain, has pushed boundaries in conservative media. This criticism of Churchill is oddly consistent with voices on the far left that often seek to dismantle traditional narratives of Western history, which they argue ignore darker chapters like imperialism and colonialism. In questioning Churchill's role and legacy, Carlson taps into a broader skepticism among some conservatives that now views American and Western history as compromised or morally dubious. Bill Maher and his guests argue that this revisionism signals a growing distrust of America's founding principles, a mindset that has not previously been popular on the right. Rather than seeing American history as a beacon of freedom and democracy, some conservative voices now echo the critique of the far left, arguing that America's past is inherently flawed, tainted by imperial or oppressive motives. This ideological shift represents a horseshoe effect in which the extremes of the political spectrum begin to mirror each other despite fundamental differences in policies and values.
Was the judge in Trump's hush money trial right to delay sentencing? Oh, yeah, that happened today until November 26 in order to avoid interfering in the election. Man, all those trials and nothing happened. Nothing. It was
They indicted him and they wanted to try him on a political schedule. They literally, if they could have, they would have had him in courtrooms from March to October, a presidential candidate of the United States, and it's just not how the court system works, thank God. This thing shouldn't be sentenced now. It was absurd. They took a misdemeanor that the statute of limitations should have expired on, and they bootstrapped it up to 34 felonies. And wanted to sentence him to jail for it. I'm not a huge Trump guy, but this I think is absurd and wrong.
Look, the larger issue obviously is January 6th, right? And the problem is with the immunity decision, history is really clear. If you don't hold people accountable when they indulge in political violence, then you get more political violence. And I'm really curious about do you think conservatives will end up supporting a constitutional amendment to overturn the immunity decision if a Democrat is president? I wonder if they will.
I think the way these kind of decisions work, we saw it with the independent counsel statute decision that Supreme Court has. In Washington, eventually this stuff always comes around and bites the other side. So right now, the Democrats are so upset the Supreme Court has done this. Then if Kamala Harris is elected and some Republican prosecutor somewhere in the middle of red America wants to indict her and prosecute her for some official act, the Supreme Court will say no, and Democrats will suddenly, wait a minute, maybe that decision wasn't so outrageous.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll tell you,
after
what
all.
we've seen is this tendency on both ends of the political spectrum to score partisan points at the expense of confidence in our institutions.
Yeah, but Trump really does commit crimes. Let's not forget that little part of it.
After a moderate opening where Bill Maher and his guests had a common target for criticism, they had certain divisions when it came to the topic of politics. The panelists delve into the thorny territory of Trump's legal battles, highlighting how these cases are perceived by different factions. For some, these proceedings represent the system holding a powerful figure to account, a vital step in proving that no one, not even a former president, is above the law. Others view them as political maneuvers designed to weaken Trump's future aspirations, arguing that a precedent of prosecuting political opponents could fuel cycles of retribution in American politics. This schism, they warn, risks tearing apart an already frayed sense of institutional trust. Central to their discussion is the impact of immunity decisions, both now and in the future. These legal protections, traditionally reserved for high-ranking officials to prevent political weaponization of the justice system, are now being scrutinized like never before. The panel worries about a precedent where such immunity becomes a partisan tool, shielding one side while exposing the other to full prosecutorial force. This selective immunity could erode faith in the fairness of the system, creating an atmosphere of cynicism toward government and courts alike.
Well, foreign policy doesn't decide elections usually, but foreign policy is really critical at this moment. I believe there is this, as you mentioned earlier, this axis of aggressors that is supporting each other. They're supporting each other in ways that are unprecedented. And I believe these cascading crises 100%. From Europe to the Middle East have a very high potential of cascading further into the Indo-Pacific before inauguration. I think we're entering a period of maximum danger. We have a president who sadly has diminished cognitive capacity. We have ourselves at each other's throats. Then we're going to have a period maybe after the election. And I think this Russian report is a setup for post-election because the Russians, what they really want is most of us to doubt the result of the election.
Yes.
So I think that period between election and inauguration is very dangerous.
But the next 60 days, to your point, right? I mean, part of the goal of Russian disinformation and foreign autocratic disinformation is to divide our democracy, to make it dysfunctional. And that's why that division and dysfunction is something we need to confront. And the stakes of the election do determine the trajectory of the 21st century. It is about autocracy versus democracy at home and abroad.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I hope they get asked those questions. What will your policy be on Iran? What we were discussing earlier.
I think, Bill, though, it is key that the whole debate over the mics being open or closed, and it's obvious why Kamala Harris wanted them open. If the mics had been open in the first debate, there's no way Joe Biden ever, in this course of rambling answer with lots of pauses, would have finally been able to say, look, we finally beat Medicare. Trump would have interrupted him like 5 times before he got it and saved him.
As the panel turns to foreign policy and national security, a grim picture emerges of a world fraught with escalating dangers. Former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster warns of a growing axis of aggressors, a coalition of authoritarian powers, chiefly Russia and China, whose coordinated ambitions challenge global stability and America's influence. This alliance, he argues, seeks to upend the existing international order, destabilizing regions through calculated disinformation, economic coercion, and military aggression. The conversation then shifts to the Biden administration's approach to these rising threats, with panelists expressing skepticism over current strategies, particularly in the Middle East and regarding Iran. Biden's policy, they argue, reflects a hesitancy to exert force or impose meaningful consequences, thereby emboldening adversaries. For example, despite recent provocations, the administration has held back on reinstating or fully enforcing sanctions against Iran, leaving the region in a state of heightened volatility. This perceived weakness, the panelists suggest, may have ripple effects, potentially encouraging hostile nations to test the boundaries of American patience and commitment. Yet, the discussion is not a simple endorsement of past policies either, as Trump's foreign policy legacy comes under the spotlight for its own contradictions. While some panelists credit Trump with decisive actions such as his hard stance on China and his support for Ukraine, a stance stronger than that of the Obama administration, they also point to the unpredictability that defined his approach. Trump's foreign policy often oscillated between tough rhetoric and erratic moves, creating moments of strength, but also confusion among allies and adversaries alike. The resulting picture of U.S. foreign policy is one of uncertainty. America's adversaries seem increasingly bold, while allies wonder about Washington's staying power. Will America make a strong comeback on the international stage? Please join the comments to contribute your opinion. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to watch other interesting videos.